Hello, bonjour, buenos dias, ni hao, hello. Welcome to the Chapel in York Roundtable. I'm Sue Cunningham, President and CEO of the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. CASE is the membership organization for those who champion the successes of their institutions. CASE serves advancement professionals across all disciplines: fundraising, alumni relations, advancement services, marketing, and communications. Because CASE has a global membership in more than 80 countries, it gives me great pleasure to know these roundtables are occurring around the world. One of the core competencies that CASE espouses is global and cultural competence. As education is a global endeavor, intercultural understanding and communications are fundamental for success and advancement. I've had the great pleasure of living and working in 3 different continents during my career, and in each of my roles, I have spent significant time engaging with people from different countries and regions, all with the shared passion of advancing education to transform lives and society. The last year has proven to us that whether or not we are able to travel, our engagement with one another, in person or through other means, is vital. Relationships matter deeply in our work. I thank Chapel in York for its long relationship with CASE and for creating these opportunities for you to engage in robust discussion. Enjoy.
In Canada, we have Stuart Krantz, who is the President of International Fundraising Services for Chapel in York. We have Ligia Pina, who is part of our Chapel in York team for global inquiries, as well as a consultant for legacy fundraising. And we have Juan Paulo Vergueiro, forgive me if I butchered that, JP, who is head of ABCR in Brazil, which is the Brazilian Fundraising Association. So we have a breadth of experience and regional representation, and I think this can be a very engaging and educational experience as we talk about fundraising and education. But with that, I will hand it off to Stuart.
Thanks very much, Heather. It's great to see everybody on the call today. Our goal here with the roundtables at Chapel in York is to have a more intimate discussion among folks in the industry across the broad spectrum of the field. And our goal here is not to only just be able to present things, but also to try to engage and allow different individuals to participate. So we certainly encourage all of you to, over the next hour, if something comes to mind that you think would be helpful for the group as a whole to learn from, that's really the ultimate objective here, is to learn from each other, share some insights that are hopefully prescient and to the point, and leave this 1 hour with at least 1 or 2 things that maybe we didn't know before or wanted to figure out a way to engage and integrate into our work for our own organizations. So we're going to get this started by asking a few questions, 3 questions. And we've shared this globally, and I think it's a very important set of questions. And then at the end of the hour, maybe we can retrospectively look at these questions again and see if we learned anything that would be helpful for us going forward. And we have, like Heather said, representatives from both Canada and South America and Brazil, and my involvement in the United States. So we can try to think more globally in this area about how ultimately we're dealing with our work right now. The first question that I think all of us are confronting right now is, has anything about the fundraising fundamentals changed over this past year and a half? Are the principles that were sound, are they still sound right now? Or has there been a change in fundamentals in how we do our work? Certainly, all of us are confronting this right now, given technology, given the pandemic, how we cultivate, how we identify, how we solicit and steward important supporters for the organizations that we work with. The second question that I think is very important for all of us to consider right now is, what changes are necessary to get the best results right now during the rest of this pandemic as it's slowly moving out and in the future? What changes are we confronting? I think we could all learn from each other with some examples of things that we're addressing right now in our work. And the third question that I think is really important for all of us to explore is, what can institutions learn from the experiences over this past year and a half that can improve their fundraising for the long term? These three questions, I think, in many ways frame hopefully a conversation we can all have over the next hour. We'll go back to them a little bit, but I wondered if we could talk a little bit about some considerations that can help us try to answer these questions. The first one I'd like to pose, and then I'll maybe make a comment or two, and then I'd like to turn it over to both the three other speakers for any insight that they may have, is the cases for support, which are so critically important for our academic institutions, our educational institutions. You know, it's clear that the cases for support, a lot of us are sort of pondering what's changed over this past year and a half, and how are those cases and those giving opportunities shifting for institutions large and small. And it's worth noting that this is clearly a crucial time to review our cases, and we certainly have over this past year, and ensure that they address the important issues that prospects, donors, alumni are thinking right now. And JP, I wondered if I could ask you to make a comment or two. What are you seeing in Brazil? What are you seeing in your network with regards to how the shift in cases are happening?
Perfect. Thank you, Stuart. First of all, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Chapel New York, for the invitation. I'm really happy to see some faces that are already new, like Lydia and Heather, that actually both of them have been with us in Brazil to our fundraising conference. And it's my pleasure to meet all the others. On the question you've made, Stuart, and please, if you please interrupt me if anytime you don't understand my English. I try to do my best, but it's not always as we would like to, not being native. But what I would I'd like to start just by pointing out that in Brazil and most of Latin America countries, I would say, we come from another philanthropic background, or even in education. Here in Brazil, for example, most of universities, or the best universities of the country, are public owned and public funded by the government. And it goes in many other countries of the region. Despite that, we do have a good number of philanthropic universities in the region. I myself was a student of public management 20 years ago with a scholarship. I was funded by a scholarship in a philanthropic college in Brazil, in São Paulo. And actually right now I'm a donor to their scholarship program in order to be able to fund others to have the same opportunity I had. And what we have been seeing in this last year, what has been changing, and I can say that bluntly, very bluntly, is that we are learning to make the ask. It's really, really uncommon for philanthropic universities and colleges in Brazil to fundraise. It's not the norm here, it's an exception, actually. The college I went to 20 years ago was, by that time, the only one that we knew in Brazil that had a fundraising department. It's called Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and it's been 20 years. And I can count in my fingers. I think there are 5 or 6 that in Brazil are fundraising in a more structured way. But because of the pandemic, we saw a surge in generosity in Brazil. We've never donated as much as we have in our country since last year, over $1.3 billion in donations to fight the virus and the impact of the virus. And of course, this has impacted as well on fundraising for education. Right now, I have actually 2 jobs. I am the CEO for the Brazilian Fundraisers Association in Brazil, but I'm also a professor at a philanthropic college called FECAP in the city of São Paulo, and I have been invited by them to implement their fundraising department and their alumni departments. And just by making the ask, for the first time, we have seen the beginning of the connection with former students, with the alumni community, giving back to the college and allowing us to increase the opportunities we give to low-income students and disadvantaged students. So what we have learned and we have seen that has beginning to change in Brazil, people are getting used to being asked for donations from a philanthropic university, and ourselves from the institutions are starting to understand that we can be funded by the donations of our former alumni as well.
Thank you very much, JP. That's really interesting. Michelle, we have quite a few universities on this call that are significant and large, complex organizations on this call I'm noticing right now. Queens is obviously similar to that in Canada. I wondered if you could comment a little bit on the sort of the case for support, what's changed, what's not changed, and how it's been sort of implemented on the ground in speaking with and engaging with alumni.
Thanks, Stuart. Well, I've honestly, I'm in an interesting position because I actually just came to Queens quite recently. It was at another institution, another what we call a U15, so a major research institution here in Canada, during the pandemic. So I actually made the transition during the pandemic. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in both institutions is increased donor receptivity to funding opportunities relating to healthcare, mental health in particular. Wellness is a very salient topic, I think, across the board during this pandemic. And so that we've seen it's resonated quite well with our donor constituency. The other thing, and I'm not sure that this is solely pandemic related, but one of the things that I've observed is in the Canadian context, at least, is an increased engagement of our academic partners in the work of advancement. And so that we're seeing, I think more than ever, academics who are really deeply entrenched, as they always should be, in the case building work. And we are sort of at a stage in Canadian universities where perhaps a little more mature in terms of our fundraising than Brazil, if I can say that, JP, but perhaps not as mature as our American counterparts. And so we are across Canada seeing less dollars and less reliance on government funding, which has been, in Canadian universities at least, the traditional method of funding post-secondaries, and increased reliance on philanthropy and our donor community. So that's an interesting transition during the pandemic, because as we know, we need our academic partners to participate in the work of building those cases and in talking with donors and sharing those cases out to donors. At the same time, it's new for them. So there's a lot of work to be done to support our academic partners in understanding this world of advancement and philanthropy, and how to speak to donors in a way that resonates with donor motivation, interest, passion, and in a way that still helps us achieve our objectives as an institution.
That's really interesting. And I wondered if anybody else on the call, not necessarily the speakers, have any sort of wisdom or experiences they would like to share on how they have engaged academic partners especially during this time, and whether there's been a similar experience where additional partners were involved or have been involved. By all means, please either raise your hand or put it in the chat so that all of us can learn from that. as a follow-up question, I wondered, and this could go to Heather and Ligia, or anybody actually on this call, which is, let's follow up with that in terms of engaging the faculty and administration maybe in new ways. I wondered if that has been also a tool for improving and increasing cultural understanding and cultural differences, because really in many ways these roundtables are focused on, or the intent was on, international fundraising, on the institution's efforts to try to diversify their funding streams from alumni and others across borders. And whether, Michelle, what you were talking about, maybe you can follow up with that. Has that also been utilized as a tool for improving cultural understanding of alumni in different parts of the world? And maybe the academics have some knowledge about that. Does anybody want to, maybe Michelle, you can, do you have any sense of that or not?
That's an interesting question that you ask. I think if I connect it back to the pandemic specifically, I would say one of the things I think we've all observed is that we've been able to connect with alumni across the world. So, I mean, it's just been wonderful to see activities and events that normally would be very much relegated to a particular geographical community really open up and have a lot more participation and engagement from our alumni across the world. But I can't say specifically to the pandemic, but I think, Stuart, like, it is an opportunity for us to engage our academics in broadening, because our academics are working across the world, right? They're doing research across the world. They have global networks. And so they have some really critical pieces of information that is useful for us from the advancement perspective on how to perhaps appeal to our donor constituencies in areas that we may not have previously really been able to tap into.
JP, I wondered if you wanted to add any insight into that, as well as I wondered if you could also share your insights into not just the sort of expanding need for cultural understanding and faculty or other senior leadership, but also whether this has shifted in your perspective in Brazil, cultivation strategies or solicitation. You talk about solicitations has increased. Has your engagement with senior leadership and academic leadership shifted at all in your understanding in Brazil?
It's starting to, Stuart, and I don't think we are there yet. But for my example, from where I come from, FICAP and other institutions that I am aware of, senior management, they were the ones to start prioritizing fundraising for educational institutions. It's coming from above, from the board, actually, the need to invest on a fundraising structure to promote the development of the organization. We have been going through an economic crisis as well, and most of these institutions have always been funded by their students, by the fee, the monthly fee they pay, but they are losing students as well. So they've started to understand that they should be prioritizing the alumni community in our city or anywhere in Brazil or even abroad. It's not as huge as in the US, but we do have overseas communities of students as well. So it's coming from the superior departments or areas of our institutions. But we also have been facing a few challenges to do that. For example, most of our colleges and universities, they don't have a good data system with information on their former students. We've gone through so many databases, systems have changed in so many times around, I don't know, the last 20 years. We've lost track, and actually we don't have data actual data on most of the students. In my college, we have around 30,000 alumni, and we probably don't have like over 5,000 emails. The second challenge around here is GDPR. By law, we are not allowed to make the ask to them because they didn't sign up for that when they enrolled to be students in our college. So I'm supposed not to ask for donations to the alumni. I've been doing that, and I've also asking for their consent. But I know I will be facing a few issues in the next couple of years or even months, and this will happen with the other philanthropic institutions that start implementing their fundraising strategies right now.
Can I ask a question about that? Stuart, do you mind if I jump in there?
Oh, please do.
I'm just really curious, JP. So you can't make the ask. That, I mean, wow, that is a challenge. But how can you reach out to your alumni, ask for consent for further communication, and then be allowed to make the ask, or do you have to explicitly ask for consent to make an ask?
Well, that's the deal. We can they have been getting our weekly newsletters, and they've supposedly signed to be informed to be reached by us on a weekly basis with institutional information. But they did not allow us to ask for donations to them. So what we have been doing is in our weekly newsletters or bulletins or even online on our website, we've been asking them to then give us the consent for us to also send them our fundraising campaigns, our appeals, and so on and so forth.
Has that been very successful?
Well, it's quite recent. The law is 1 year old. It hasn't been really enforced all around the country. So right now we are walking on, I don't know how to say that in English, but on a very tight space, a gray area. It's because the law hasn't been really enforced. It won't work. We will have to invest to actually update their data, to reach out to the alumni community. We need to invest a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Chapel in York works with a number of universities and schools around the world, and many of them are dealing with the GDPR issue, as I'm sure maybe some institutions, organizations on this call. It brings up another important question, which is the whole notion of volunteers who work internationally for the universities and others that are represented on this call. You know, I'm curious if anybody wants to weigh in on this, which is how will engagement with international volunteers globally be or has been affected or will be affected going forward because of the pandemic, the utilization of new technologies, et cetera. We're going to assume that online participation in many ways is here to stay permanently. And on one side, we could see that as a huge net positive, but it could also offer a whole series of challenges. And the question is whether we can learn as a group about what some of these opportunities and challenges are. Michelle, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I do have thoughts, maybe not specifically about volunteers, but one of the things that Queen's has done and has made this decision to do is to adopt, in our advancement portfolio, is to adopt a remote first philosophy moving forward. Which means that our entire advancement shop will be, not necessarily all be remote, but our philosophy will be remote first. We will have workers. I am actually one of those who work remotely. I do my job remotely. I live several provinces away. And we've hired more and more people. I mean, Queens is in a small community. So being able to recruit and retain talent outside of that small community is really important. And The pandemic has been a perfect opportunity for us to really rethink the opportunity to have our advancement staff in a remote type of environment. You know, I think it'll be interesting to see post-pandemic, if we'll ever truly be post-pandemic, but how that will play out. And one of the things we're grappling with philosophically is how to normalize the culture of a remote first philosophy. Because, I mean, you can have remote workers, but people will still gather in boardrooms, and then, you know, I'll be the lone face on a video in the middle of a boardroom, and that doesn't socialize and normalize the remote first workplace. So very interesting thinking that we have going on about what the pandemic, what we've learned from the pandemic.
Thank you, Michelle. Eugene, would you like to share some thoughts about this? We can't hear you, Eugene.
Here we go. I've been doing this for a year and a half, and I still can't remember what I'm supposed to do. In any case, my name is Eugene Marr. I'm a Director of Development, specifically for Asia for Boston University. And actually, I believe I'm joined by my colleague on the alumni relations side from BU, Yuna Lee. So Yuna, feel free to jump in if you would like to kind of say more in terms of the comments that I will make, which will be very much in contrast to what Michelle just shared, because I was frankly really surprised to hear her say that at Queen's the intent is to, you know, kind of keep going remote, and it could be a question of government policy, or I don't know. What I can tell you is that with Boston University, and I think I represent many of the schools, certainly in the Boston area and many schools across the US, is that while the last 15 months have been this unplanned experiment in doing everything virtually, from delivering education to our students and shifting everything we do in advancement to Zoom and to virtual, and we've learned a huge amount from that. And one of the lessons is that to a certain extent you can conduct alumni relations and can conduct fundraising remotely. Where our experience, I think, at BU is that is much more feasible domestically in the US, because so many other aspects of life and work have shifted remotely. Where we did not find that translated quite as well was internationally. While Yuna can tell you about many of the programs that she came up with and successfully executed with our Asian alumni in terms of alumni engagement, I can tell you that it was very difficult to get meaningful appointments and conversations with donors and prospects who were 11, 12, 13 time zones away. Now, in contrast to what Michelle is saying, our institution, frankly, always wanted to move back to face-to-face, campus-based education as quickly as it was deemed feasible and safe. And for now, at least, our leadership has said that date, assuming that things continue to go well from a public health perspective, that date will be September. And so while this year we had an educational model called Learn from Anywhere, which meant that students could be on campus, and actually, you know, the campus was pretty well populated for the academic year, more so in the second semester than in the first, particularly as it relates to international students. But that model is actually being closed. I mean, you know, that chapter of the book is going to be shut. And that's an indication of the fact that BU is telling its students, if you want to continue with your education, you have to come to campus in September. You will not have Learn from Anywhere available to you as an alternative. So we are very much returning to that approach. And that same philosophy also will be in effect for advancement. And so whereas our whole division was for the most part operating remotely since last March, indeed, this week was the first week that a group of us were, if you will, required to come to the office for at least a few days of the week. That will continue until the end of the summer. And then the expectation is that beginning in September, when the new academic year begins, that almost all of us will be expected and indeed perhaps required to be on campus for the overwhelming majority of our work days.
Thank you, Eugene. Una, please pipe in if you feel you have something. You can just raise your hand, I suppose. There are some other great universities here, and I'd be curious for the purposes of this roundtable if there's Brandeis, Swarthmore, Illinois, Carnegie Mellon, and a number of others. If you could at least share with the group in one way, shape, or form what your experiences are as well. Yes, Eugene, the expectation, and we're noticing it with a number of organizations that we work with, there is an emphasis to try to get back to some degree of normality, which answers some of the question we said in the beginning, which is what are some of the staples that are going to be maintained versus not maintained. The question that I think we're all confronting is, how is new technology that we have now almost become eponymous to our work, going to shift this work as we start to try to go back to normal? Justine, did you want to weigh in here? It'd be great.
Well, I just thought I'd share a little bit of what Cornell has seen regarding both our alumni volunteers and the actual alumni affairs and development staff's role in engaging them over the past year. With regard to using this technological shift, we, especially amongst our alumni and our high-level alumni volunteer leadership, there's long been this kind of culture of bringing everyone back to Ithaca in New York and having these return to the nest, wonderful symposia and board meetings and chances to engage directly with faculty. And that always makes everyone feel really good. What it also ends up doing is the experience of coming back to Ithaca is only available to people that live fairly close to Ithaca, or at least within the continental US. And so over the past year, as everything shifted online, what it meant was that alumni and donors and volunteers that live far away have been able to kind of participate on an equal footing with their closer peers. And I think we've heard directly from alumni over the past several weeks. We've had them join our Zoom calls to talk about their experience. And I think as both staff and employees and those that give of their time to the university, there's going to be, going forward, a radical shift, like Michelle said, to a kind of remote first, to kind of bring new, so that those who are far away from us, that we can still benefit from their experiences and their time and their expertise without saying, you can't really be, a board member or an advisory board member or a university counselor unless you can leave your family for 7 days to come from China to middle of nowhere, New York. So there's this, I like that equity. And I think most people are responding very, very positively to that equity. And it just means that kind of coming out of this year and going forward, we're going to have a lot more opinions and experiences joining the kind of chorus of what goes on at the university.
Super.
Yeah, I will
Anybody
say
else?
when I've worked in higher education in the past, and I remember working for a large resource university, and we had a high percentage of international students. So we had alumni chapters based internationally as well. And at the time, kind of that transition that started taking place where universities wanted to not have chapter models anymore, and it was too much staffing and time and investment to try to manage all these little outposts, so to speak. So there's kind of a pushing away from that. And I think there was also a concern, it's too hard to try to engage with volunteers when they're not nearby, and you're not getting the same kind of connection. I think it's been interesting to see the shift that the pandemic kind of brought back, and thinking about maybe we can have these connections across miles and time zones, and maybe it is okay to engage with people who are on the ground locally rather than thinking that we have to be in every place that there is an alumni population. And I've even seen a lot of members, both recently joining or have been part of the US Foundation for Chapel New York, talking about how they're realizing they haven't been using technology well to keep their alumni engaged, not just for fundraising purposes, but just in general, keeping that relationship with their alma mater, helping them feel remembered and valued, and connecting them with that experience beyond the time that they spent as a student. One person I was speaking to in Melbourne said, I don't want people to feel that it's out of sight, out of mind. And I fear that we've been doing that for far too many years. She said this really helped us realize that there's no need to have that limitation. So I think in some ways it's been good in thinking about how you can engage volunteers and how you can leverage technology better. And seeing it be effective. I think there was kind of a fear of that change before the change was forced. So I think maybe some of the more risk-averse institutions have had to take that leap and have found it to be beneficial, not just for themselves, but for the alumni that they would like to keep connected.
Michelle?
Yeah, something you said sort of struck a chord with me, Heather, and it's almost, I think, in some ways forced us to be more strategic with the ways that we're engaging people, right? Because, I mean, there was sort of a menu and a plethora of, newsletters and events and all these things that we just sort of, perhaps we're far less strategic in sort of sending out to our alumni base, and because we're in a situation which we're very cognizant about the amount of emails, Zoom meetings that we're pushing out to our donor community, it's forced us in many ways to be a lot more thoughtful about what it is we're sending to our donor and alumni constituencies and how we're asking them to engage with us.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Michelle. The other side of the same coin is the whole question of leadership, senior leadership, and how we engage them in the work that we do, because in many ways that's so critical to how the best use of this new technology, if and when we're going to use it. We've always known, obviously, that senior leadership is a critical element with our international development work. And the pandemic in a lot of ways has forced us to think much more creatively on how best to utilize leadership in our efforts in this way. And there's been a lot of creative, excellent approaches to utilizing leadership and bring the campus closer to prospects and donors around the world. I mean, Eugene was very, very compelling in a lot of ways, which is, hey, things worked great before, and it's really important that we have students back on campus. It's really important that the development office is, utilizes the expertise that they have, that they've known for decades, have worked in certain ways. I've certainly spoken to a lot of fundraisers lately around the globe, and many have shared examples of how senior leadership has been implemented, utilized using various technologies, et cetera. I'm going to pose this question first to Eugene because as it's kind of an interesting way to follow up with what he said before, which is, Eugene, if there is an expectation from senior leadership that the development office, is certainly in international fundraising, will go back to some of the strategies used in the past, is there also an expectation that senior leadership will be utilized in the same ways as before? And is there any new insights using technologies that you can share with the group in how senior leadership would be utilized given those expertise?
Yeah, no, Stuart, thank you for giving me another chance to weigh in here. I think that's kind of TBD. I think that the issue is really the use of senior leadership time. And if they feel that they can be equally effective shifting some of their interactions with alumni and particularly prospects, board members, etc., to an online model, then they will do it, right? Because rather than say making 3 trips a year internationally, maybe this will allow them to make 2 or 1 and be just as effective and have the same level of engagement and loyalty. Then of course they will say, hey, great, that gives me back however many hours on my schedule. I think where we are anticipating that will be the case to the greatest degree, and we in fact are talking about trying to pilot this, is with, if you will, the next level of management, meaning deans and maybe senior faculty and directors of large units at the university, who in the past normally would have found it very, very difficult to travel internationally, partially for budgetary reasons and partially because there may not have been the concentrations of alumni in particular locations to warrant a trip. Whereas if we were trying to put together a big event in some spot, if we could get the president or the provost, some trustees to come to that, well, then that was considered enough of a draw to bring people out. But if you will, with all due respect to any deans, if you're only going to send out the dean of engineering or the law school or whatever, you may not get enough of a return on that investment. And that was true not only from the advancement point of view, but from the point of view of that dean or faculty member. So where we think we have kind of opened a possible new way of doing our work is to get more of the deans involved so that we can kind of spread it out a little bit. In other words, in the past, the pyramid was a very steep one. You either got the president or the provost, or it kind of wasn't worth putting together a trip. But now we are at least open to the concept of maybe flattening it a little bit and bringing the next level of management and university leadership. But instead of trying to get them to come out to a particular geography, which would not have been possible in the past and probably won't be possible in the future, let's try to do that in a more either virtual way or in a more hybrid way. So I think that's where the last 15 or 16 months have given us some ideas that we will work with. But as far as senior leadership is concerned, for instance, we've had this international board meeting, which I think Stuart, I talked to you about in the past, which took place twice a year in all these, wonderful international locations. We are still hoping to do that come October in London. So whereas you might think, oh, okay, we still don't know what the situation is going to be in terms of travel, in terms of vaccinations and public health. But despite that, if you will, our president is saying, let's try to keep that on the calendar and let's see if there is enough interest and engagement on the part of our governance leaders to be willing, and if you will, be brave enough to come to London in October. So we're plowing ahead, and until we are told otherwise.
Thank you, Eugene. JP, there's a lot of discussion around the world that the United States fundraising culture in higher education and academia, actually in other sectors too, is sort of what a lot of countries seek to learn from, emulate, try to become, they, for whatever reason, both positively and probably not so great too. because, United States is a big country and there's some institutions and fundraisers doing great work and others that could do better as well. I wondered if you could give a little sense from the Brazilian standpoint. I mean, is Brazil higher education, are they trying to integrate certain strategies that's the US and ways of doing things, or are there other unique ways in which they're going to focus on building their programs that we can all learn from as well?
Sure, Stuart, that's a really good question. And it's one that we debate around here a lot. Should we be mimicking Americans' philanthropic culture? Should we be searching for our own? And there's no right answer there. Of course, for example, you were talking about volunteers. We do have a few Brazilian higher education institutions that have alumni chapters in New York. I know at least 2 or 3 of them, and it's pretty much the same that you do, but in other countries or other cities or other states. And we have been having institutions here in Brazil hosting galas for their educational work, 5Ks, and so on and so forth. So we look up to the United States, and we try to learn from what's the best that's happening, but we do have many, of course, cultural differences that it makes it sometimes harder for us to go forward on those learnings and experiences. For example, we don't have the concept here in Brazil, and I think in most of Latin American countries, we don't have the concept of giving back. And it's very hard for us to fundraise for education, for example. If people don't understand or don't believe that they should be supporting others to have the same opportunities or experience that they had when they were at a higher educational institution. So in explaining, there's no translation of giving back in Portuguese, for example. So, and actually there's a strong belief in Brazil that education should be a government role. We already pay taxes, so why should we give to universities, for example, if it's government duty, and it's actually written in our constitution that's a government duty to support basic and higher education. So we learn, we look up, we learn, we go to conferences, we study a lot, and now online we're studying even more, and we try to find our own way, considering the culture we have in Brazil for philanthropy, or the culture sometimes we don't have in Brazil for philanthropy.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for that background. Heather, I wondered if you wanted to share any, I know you have worked with organizations outside the United States as well, and have, whether you've sensed any, because of the pandemic, is there a shift in how organizations that you might be engaged with in what they want to integrate as sort of the future for fundraising, structures, strategies? Is it shifting at all because maybe some limitations on budgets, or because technology now, they might feel that they can do a lot of the work that they, maybe they don't have to have a gala in New York, for example, anymore, or they don't have to travel, for 1 week to meet 6 alumni or whatever. Are you noticing any shift from outside the United States?
I have noticed that quite a bit. And again, I think this gets to the point I was making earlier. In many instances, there was a hesitancy to try to engage donors or alumni digitally. There was kind of the thought that you're only going to have a meaningful connection or a meaningful conversation if you can be there sitting across the table from someone. And I think in many cases, we just, as fundraisers, just made the assumption that that's what the donor wanted most as well. And I think because the environment forced us to adapt, if we wanted to keep those conversations going, we learned that not only are we able to have meaningful conversations and connections and adapt events into being virtual gatherings and have that still be a meaningful community building time, that in many cases the alumni and the donors welcomed that it was less intrusive, I think, in some ways for them. It's easier to fit it in the schedule. They're kind of meeting on their terms a little bit more, I think, by being able to do it in a virtual space versus having to arrange for a place to meet and take, booking off time and the travel. So I think it's actually been a very positively received experience on both sides of the equation. And I've seen a lot of the organizations outside the US really embrace that. And I think leveraging kind of the environment as an opportunity to start to make that, I don't want to say pivot because I don't think it's that sharp of a turn, but gradual curve into leaning in and thinking about who are audiences that perhaps they've been hesitant to reach out to because they felt they couldn't physically be there enough, and realizing, now the question becomes, how can we, I think, grow our reach and connection through the new tools that we've learned how to use in this time.
Yeah, that's just spot on in so many ways, Heather. I appreciate you framing it that way. I mean, it does bring up this sort of consideration, which is it's sort of crucial at this time to focus on what we know about fundraising, even though so much is changing around us. I mean, we can't forget that cultivating a diverse international donor pool requires, as I think Eugene was saying quite eloquently, sort of time-tested development methods that apply to fundraising programs, small and large. Yes, some new awareness and finesse is needed, similar to what Heather's saying. Why aren't we need to figure out how to use these tools effectively. And institutions and their leaders around the world, we certainly noticed it at Chapel in York, must meet donors where they are, both geographically, culturally, technologically, et cetera. And I don't think international fundraising, what we've noticed at Chapel in York, needs to be that complex. I don't think we need to analyze this, but it does require certainly significant time, money to achieve sort of what the literacy is necessary for true, what many of us would call donor-centered fundraising. So, I think what we're saying in this past hour is that there's great technologies, but there's also time-tested strategies that we have to utilize. We have different countries that have different levels of sophistication and philanthropic sort of cultures that have to be brought into question as well. Clearly, there is room for being optimistic, even as we're slowly coming out of this pandemic. There's clearly always a demand for education around the world, everywhere. And alumni are starting to live everywhere around the world. I mean, there was a lot of question earlier about whether the pandemic would shift that and that we wouldn't have as many international alumni in the years and decades ahead because of this. But I don't think that's necessarily panning out in terms of data, that there's still I live in California and the number of international applicants for our schools is quite dramatic and growing. Academic institutions in many ways prepare students for a career. They train the next generation of leaders, and that's definitely not going to shift. And the problem solvers at universities are clearly so remarkable, as we all know, and they're best prepared to, in many ways, make the greatest impact with philanthropy going forward. So, I think there's room to be optimistic, but there's also room for fundraising leaders and leadership, like we all are, to play a really important role in the future about how development offices adapt and grow and be more responsive to what's happening. So in many ways, we go back to the early questions that we shared in the beginning of our talk, which was, has anything really changed about the fundamentals of fundraising? Are the principles that were sound still sound? And it sounds like from those who shared today that in many ways the principles are still sound, and organizations in many ways that were weak in donor relations before or cultivation before are probably not well placed to deal with the challenging times ahead. And those organizations that were sound before in many ways in how they engaged, identified, cultivated, solicited, and stewarded are well positioned to do some really remarkable things in the future. And in many ways, institutions that use this experiences that they're going through right now to improve their fundraising in the long term, those that do it are absolutely well placed and are going to probably succeed and see greater results going forward than those that did not use this time to explore and et cetera. So we urge you, certainly from Chapel in York, but myself, and I'm sure all of you would agree, that beyond coping and look at, beyond just the need to cope, look at this opportunity in many ways as a sort of an Uber moment. I think as a fundamental change that might help to integrate some of these new strategies for the future. I'll leave it at that. And if anybody wants to share, we just have a minute or two, by all means, jump in now. And if not, we will hopefully see you at a future roundtable as we continue to have these discussions going forward. This will also be recorded, so you're happy to log in later and see it. Michelle, Heather, JP, anybody? Okay, well, thanks again for all of you for joining today. We hope that you have one or two things that you can take away from joining your colleagues from around the United States and in different parts of the world, including Canada and Brazil. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.